Hey guys, how's it going? So, Final Fantasy XIV has had its first raid nerf in years. The encounter? P8S Hephaestus. I think that this really shows that the developers have been on the ball with making sure that the encounters were tuned properly. You know, before really getting into Final Fantasy XIV, I had spent years raiding in World of Warcraft, and in that game, well, raid encounters, they were nerfed all the time. So to learn that it had been years in Final Fantasy XIV, well, that's quite frankly, astonishing. And the reason the encounters are so well tuned makes a lot of sense. The developers have a team that actually fight them. A novel idea, right? And I don't mean in debug mode where they are just testing the mechanics. No, they go at it like raiders would, with the appropriate item level, food, medicines, materia, all that jazz. And for years, this led to well-tuned raid encounters. So then, what happened here? Why did this encounter need to get nerfed? Well, it's because the test team assumed that the player base would be, just that much better than them. This led them to overshoot how much HP to give the boss, because, they wanted to give the player base a good challenge. It was the testers' modesty that led to this slight overtuning. It wasn't a case of just pumping up the stats really high and seeing what would happen. So, what kind of nerf are we looking at here? Like I said previously, I was used to how raiding and nerfing worked in World of Warcraft, where bosses would sometimes see drastic nerfs to their HP. I mean, I was used to seeing numbers like a 15% nerf, and sometimes ballooning even higher than that. Now, in Final Fantasy XIV, the developers had to nerf this raid encounter by a number that was so shocking that it blew my mind. 1%. They had to reduce the HP by 1%. That barely seems like a nerf at all. But hey, if you have to nerf something, it should be like playing golf. You want the smallest number possible, and in this case, I would say the developers hit a hole-in-one. All kidding aside, in the context of a raid encounter for Final Fantasy XIV, a boss having its HP reduced by 1% can be pretty impactful. It's not that uncommon to barely beat an enraged timer by the skin of your teeth. I've seen the enraged cast timer being literally a pixel away from being a party wipe. One of the most intense close calls I ever had was when a boss probably should have gotten the enraged cast off, but due to a little bit of lag from one of our DPS, we were actually able to get an extra attack in before the enraged cast went off. The screen went black, like we wiped, and then we were all surprised to see that we'd actually won. Now, to be fair, we were not playing perfectly. We did have some mistakes along the way, but when we cleaned it up, the enraged timer, it was not an issue anymore. And I'll get to how this relates to the nerf in a little bit. Anyways, so why did this encounter need to be nerfed? What happens when a boss is overtuned? How does that affect raiding? Well, for one, when a DPS check is too tight, the meta starts to get embraced much more. Groups start to only want the flavor of the month jobs that have the highest DPS potential. Now, that certainly happens to a degree, even when the DPS checks aren't ridiculously tight, and there will always be those who only want to play what is theoretically going to put out the most damage, but I don't think the game should be balanced around that. That would just take away choice. It also isn't a very nice feeling being pigeonholed into playing a job you might not like because it does more damage, and because the DPS check is so tight, that by not playing that job, you feel like you are holding your group back. It's a no-win scenario. Another issue with a really tight DPS check is, I truly believe that there's a fine line between making an encounter challenging, while still being fun, and making an encounter so challenging that it starts to become more of a chore. I watched some of the World First race, and for this encounter, it started to look like more of a chore. When you can flawlessly execute all of the mechanics, and are still failing at the DPS check, That doesn't feel very good. And that is a feeling I've experienced before, when I raided in World of Warcraft. There had been several occasions where my guild could do all the mechanics flawlessly, but still failed because of a super strict DPS check. Another problem with having a really tight DPS check is there is only so much control you have over your DPS, and DPS isn't 100% consistent. Your control ends at knowing your rotation and your priorities. A player has zero control over how many crits they will have, how often their abilities will proc, and those sort of things might not matter all that much when the DPS check isn't super tight, but when you are scrounging around for that little bit of extra damage to meet an enrage, well then that can really make the difference. I guess the last thing is, just because something is possible for those in the World First Race, whose groups are, by the way, full of some of the best players in the game, that isn't a good indicator of what it will be like for the rest of the raiding community. I think a good analogy here is speedrunning. Just because there are a relatively small percentage of players that can beat video games really, really fast, that doesn't mean the game should be balanced around what those types of players are capable of. Personal bias here, but I've never really loved DPS checks that were super tight. I mean, if you are messing up on mechanics and you barely make their enrage, well, that's one thing. But otherwise, it's like, DPS is just, like I said earlier, there's only so much control you have over it. And a strict DPS check just, well, it doesn't feel good to me. The way you get around it is by gaming the system. You start to bring the flavor of the month jobs, you start really looking into the meta, you start doing split runs, you look for any minuscule advantage that you can get, which often leads to players losing out on choice and playing jobs that they might not love. Anyways, that is all for this one. I'm sorry I haven't had a video out in a bit, I've had a lot going on, but thank you so much for watching this one, and hey, if you liked what you saw, please like and subscribe, and until next time, bye!